In the Bible, there are a lot of different kinds of literature. There are historical sections, there are sections of law, there are parables and stories, there are letters, and this may surprise you, but a quarter, 25% of the Bible is poetry. And paying attention to the genre, the type of literature is important. Now, we do it automatically with most things. We don't read a legal document like a will or a land contract the same way we would read a novel. We don't read a newspaper with the same expectations as we read an anniversary card from our spouse. And so in this episode of the Discover the Word podcast, part 2 of a 5-episode series on this, the group is going to continue a conversation about how to read the Psalms, a book that fits into the genre of poetry. And there really are few, if any, hard and fast rules that govern all kinds of poetry. Poetry allows the writers the freedom to express themselves in a lot of different ways. For example, most of the poetry we're familiar with uses rhyme, but poems don't have to rhyme. Haiku, a Japanese type of poetry, counts the syllables, 5 syllables in the first line, 7 in the second, and 5 in the third, for a total of 17 syllables. And there are sonnets, ballads, acrostics, limericks, free verse, lots of forms of poetry, each with different characteristics. Well, the Psalms are poetry, Hebrew poetry. And so we're going to begin this episode talking about probably the most common characteristic of Hebrew poetry. The dominant characteristic of Hebrew poetry we find in the Bible is called parallelism. I remember Haddon Robinson, who led these Discover the Word conversations for so many years, saying that restatement or repetition is the key to learning. Repeating ideas is a valuable tool for communicators. Well, parallelism uses repetition. And in fact, those 2 sentences about repetition used a form of parallelism. And so this is an important part of the conversation that Daniel Ryan Day leads Elisa Morgan and Mart DeHaan and Bill Crowder into to begin this episode about this central characteristic of the Hebrew poetry in the Bible, parallelism, and how understanding parallelism can help you know how to read the Psalms.
All right, Mart, what do you think of when I say the phrase, "Don't make me repeat myself"?
Don't make me repeat
What comes to mind?
Is there a certain tone that comes into your head?
Yeah, that's a bit directive, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. Parenting comes to my mind, both being on the receiving end and the delivering end of that phrase, "Don't make me repeat myself."
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think it does raise the question, well, why are you saying that?
Mm-hmm.
Because it does need a setting.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And repeating itself is good, because it takes us a while sometimes to learn ideas, or we need to hear it in different ways. Maybe it's not the exact same phrase, but maybe we hear a phrase in another way or with a little bit of different nuance, and it helps us understand what someone's trying to say.
And sometimes you feel like, I've never heard that before, but on the other hand, you have.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so this week we're going to continue our series on the Psalms. And one of the key tools that those who wrote Psalms used was a concept called parallelism, this idea of repeating an idea or bringing new nuance to it or helping explain it by repeating an idea. So parallelism is basically just a literary device, and that's one of those fancy terms that we learned from our English teachers, like metaphor or simile, and so it's just a way to help us learn an idea or to see it differently. It's very unique to Hebrew poetry. There are other places that you can find it, but throughout the Bible, Hebrew poetry is loaded with parallelism. If you look through the Psalms or some of the other places that you see poetry, so Job, some of the other writings, you'll see that psalmists pair synonyms and antonyms, questions with a response, singular and plural nouns, masculine and feminine nouns, which is actually really hard for us to see because we don't have masculine and feminine nouns in English. There'll be a statement, and then there'll be supporting information or reasoning afterward. There'll be abstract ideas and concrete ideas put together. There's so many more options.
But all of it with repetition, right?
All of it with repetition. And there's even places, one of the things we've been talking about last week was the fact that Psalms was intentionally organized into these 5 books. And one of the ways that we see some of the intentional organization is that there's actually psalms that are parallel to each other and they're put together. And so they help describe it. And a great example of that is Psalms 103 and 104. Both begin with the phrase, "Praise the Lord, O my soul." And they're the only two in the whole book of Psalms that begin that way.
Is it a similar thing in Psalm 42 and 43 where you have a few verses and then it says, "Why are you cast down, O my soul?
Yes.
And why are you disquieted within me?" And then you go back into despair and then, "Why are you cast down, O my soul?" And then it carries on to 43. Is that another example?
Yeah, and so it kind of helps pull you through the psalm.
Okay.
So those are parallel ideas that are used to pull you to the next idea. And so I know I just referenced the 5 books of Psalms, which is probably a weird phrase for some of the people that maybe missed our conversation last week. And I'd really encourage them just to go back and listen to those, because we tracked some evidence throughout the big book of Psalms that it was intentionally organized by an anthologist who divided it into book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, book 5.
And those titles are actually in the scripture, and
Yeah.
we don't even notice them. It's stunning to see them. Book 1, Psalms 1 to 41. Oh, there it is.
Yeah, and we often look at the Psalms by just looking at an individual psalm. Maybe we use it for our prayer time, or maybe we use it for our devotions, and we just use one psalm at a time. And so for me, it was the first time that I ever noticed, oh, these psalms are meant to actually work together as well.
In telling the story, I think you said, of the nation of Israel, right?
Yeah.
Of their story.
Yeah, and so books 1 and 2 really celebrate King David, and at the end of book 2 it says, "Thus ends all the Psalms of David, son of Jesse." And then David doesn't show up that much more until book 5. And then book 3 kind of tracks the falling apart of the kingdom to exile. Book 4 makes a lot of sense when you read some of the Psalms in book 4 of a people in exile, trying to make sense of being in exile. And then book 5 celebrates the return of the people from exile. In fact, I love how Psalm 106, which is the end of book 4, ends. "Please, God, gather us from the east and the west and the north and the south. If you do, we'll praise you." And then book 5 begins with, "You did it. You gathered us
Thanks
from
for
the east and
gathering.
the south and the north and the west."
Yeah.
And they're praising him for it. And so there's this intentional organization. And parallelism helps us see that too.
Okay, before you get into parallelism, I want to backtrack because you said if we remember our English teachers. Well, I don't.
Okay.
And you said some of the literary devices were like synonyms and antonyms. For those of us who don't remember our English teachers, can you remind us what synonyms and antonyms are?
Yeah, so synonyms and antonyms. A synonym is a word that can be used to replace another word.
Okay.
They're the same, similar.
Yep.
Remember it that way. Okay.
And an antonym would be a word that is the opposite.
Okay.
And
so remember, anti
yeah.
would mean opposite. I need cheaters like that.
Yeah,
That helps me.
that's right.
Like and not like, right?
Yeah.
Synonyms like,
Like and not like.
antonyms not like.
There you go.
Okay, and what about the word genre? You ran past that.
Yeah. So the word genre will unpack throughout the whole week, but it's the different categories of a psalm. So we have other genres in literature like fiction versus nonfiction. So fiction literature is made up in someone's head or their imagination. It can be historical fiction, meaning there's some historical ideas within it, but still the story that's being told isn't a true story.
So it's a distinct kind of literature.
Yeah, so a
Okay.
distinct kind of literature, and we'll see a few different ones that show up in the Psalms this week. For today, I want to really focus in just on the idea of parallelism, and then throughout the rest of the week, anytime we see a good example of that, feel free to point it out. Today, let's turn to Psalm 131, and we're going to look for some parallel ideas. Elisa, do you want to start?
Sure. Psalm 131 from Book 5. A Song of Ascents of David. My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. But I have calmed and quieted myself. I am like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, both now and forevermore.
So what repeated ideas do we see in there?
Well, you have the not proud and the haughty.
Mm-hmm.
You have the great matters and things too difficult. So those are some parallels.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an
Similar.
interesting one because some translations say things too wonderful.
Okay.
And so you have the idea of it being such a complex idea that it creates awe.
Oh.
And so it is difficult
Mm-hmm.
and we don't understand it. But as a result of that, we see how big God is.
Mm-hmm.
Any other
And he
ideas?
talks about the idea of having a calm and a quiet spirit and quieting oneself. And then he says, it's like a child who is no longer crying for its mother's milk.
Yeah. I'm like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content.
Yeah, there's a desperation, I guess, even in a child. The weaning creates a contentment and a trust that food will come again. They learn that lesson.
Yeah. And then the psalm ends with, Israel, put your hope in the Lord. And the parallelism that's there answers the question, when? When should I put my hope in the Lord? And it ends with both now and forevermore. Okay. And so just in this psalm alone, we see, okay, not proud, not haughty. So we have kind of a further definition of what proudness is. We have, I do not concern myself with great matters. Well, what kind of great matters? Well, things that are too difficult to understand or things that are too wonderful to understand. And then the calmed and quieted myself. Well, like what? And it answers the question, like a child who's weaned, who is quiet when it's in its mother's arms because it doesn't need milk.
So based on our English teacher from a few minutes ago, all of these would basically be synonyms.
Yeah. And also it offers more explanation of the different ideas. To me, the most clear example is in verse 3 because it answers that question of when.
Can you define again parallelism, just that word?
Yeah. Parallelism is the repetition of ideas or the connection of two ideas that help explain one another. And so where we see that in verse 3 is, again, in the answering of when, or in verse 2 where it talks about calmed and quieted like a weaned child. And so that term weaned, right, means that it no longer needs the milk from its mom. And I remember as a dad watching my kids who were not weaned be in Rebecca's arms, and they were almost always unsettled because they wanted something from her in that moment. But then after they were weaned, those were the moments when they would just rest in her arms as she would hold them. So what this verse is saying is that we're calmed and quieted like a weaned child. So it brings all this nuance to the verse, this idea that we can find this place of contentment and rest and peace.
All right, a great start to part 2 of our study called How to Read the Psalms. And that's an important piece of being able to read and understand the Hebrew poetry that we find in the Bible, knowing that parallelism provides the main structural characteristic of this literary form is so helpful in knowing how to read the poetry in the Psalms. Because, as we've said before, a lot of us would say that we have a deep appreciation for the Psalms. I think many of us would attest to the fact that the Psalms have really ministered to us in the many seasons of our lives. And so what we're discovering about them is just going to enhance that and add to our understanding of them. Okay, now for the rest of this second episode of How to Read the Psalms, we're going to talk about the different genre within the genre, the different kinds of psalms that are contained in the poetic book of Psalms. And the first kind of psalm that we'll look at is the wisdom psalm. So, Daniel?
Who's the wisest person that you know, and why do you think of them as wise?
I've had a lot of people just at different seasons in my life, but I was thinking about this as you asked it, Daniel, and there are a couple of people that over all of my life, and some of them are deceased now and with Jesus, but their words still speak back to me. People like Haddon Robinson or Vernon Grounds, who were involved here at Our Daily Bread. Another one is a woman named Linda, who chaired the board of MOPS when I led it. And she's about 15 years older than me, and I always could lean into her wisdom for how to deal with a difficult decision. And I still can as a friend. She's very helpful to me.
Okay, you stole my name, both of them, Haddon Robinson and Vernon Grounds.
Yeah.
And Vernon Grounds was an older man, older than Haddon, who was on our board for a while. I learned from Haddon's words, and I learned from what Vernon Ground did not say.
Oh, it's so
He
rich.
knew how to be quiet at times. And I've often thought about those moments when I could tell by what he didn't say that, he saw some things that I wasn't seeing.
Yeah. So wisdom and experience, Elisa, wisdom and advice, and Mart, wisdom and what goes unsaid. And I think in all three examples as well, I hear a very practical nature to the wisdom. So it's not just knowing something, but it's how it affects your life.
Yeah.
One of the wisest sayings I think I have ever heard, and I'm trying to apply it, is why learn from experience when you can learn from someone else's experience? So instead of having to go through all the same difficult things and failing in the same ways, well, learn from other people's experience and other people's failures so you don't have to repeat those things.
Is that possible?
Not fully. I can say that from experience.
Yeah, somebody said, good decisions are the fruit of experience, and experience is the fruit of bad decisions. That's part of the how much can you learn from someone else's experience, right?
Yeah.
Well, this week we're talking about Psalms. We're continuing this conversation on specifically the collection of Psalms that's been put together pretty intentionally. And last week we spent a ton of time talking about the 5 different books of Psalms, book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, book 5, and that there's an actual narrative arc that shows up in the book as well.
By narrative arc, you mean what?
Yeah, so it tells a bigger story than just the individual Psalms. But not only is it a collection of Psalms, it's a collection of Psalms that are written in different genres. Last time we talked a little bit about genre, which is stuff like fiction or nonfiction.
Kinds of literature.
Kinds of literature. And each one has its own purpose. And because of the genre, it helps us understand how to read that particular psalm or that particular idea. And the reason I asked the question about wisdom is because I thought maybe we should just start with wisdom psalms, since that's the first psalm. Before we jump into it, I did want to point out there's a bunch of different genres. We don't have time to go through all of them. There's still debate on some of the genres, like should we call it a psalm of this or a psalm of that? But like a psalm of praise versus a psalm of thanksgiving, they often kind of feel the same.
And don't you find sometimes, Daniel, that in a particular song you may see fingerprints of different genre in a particular psalm?
Absolutely. In fact, that reminds me of probably my favorite quote as I was doing the research for this series, which was, the ancients were apparently not as anxious about the form as modern interpreters. Because we try to make sense of things like, oh, this psalm fits into this. But you're right, Bill. As you look through a lot of the psalms, it's like, well, this kind of has lament in the middle of a wisdom psalm and some praise and thanksgiving.
I think you mentioned to us last week, Daniel, that the Psalms are testimonies to God who hears us and responds to our cries. And that, I think, in itself speaks to the fact that these were not written as much to be analyzed as they were to be felt.
Yes. In fact, let's feel one now. And it's a really famous psalm that a lot of people have spent a lot of time with. Psalm 1, and let's just go around the table and read it together. And just keep in mind the conversation from yesterday about parallelism and see if you kind of hear some parallel ideas as well. So this is a wisdom psalm, book 1, Psalm 1 through 41, Psalm 1, verse 1. Elisa, you want to start for us?
Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night.
They are like trees planted along the riverbank, bearing fruit each season. Their leaves never wither, and they prosper in all they do.
Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction.
Any parallel ideas jump out?
Yeah, and I want to clarify that just for a second, Daniel, and ask you. So parallelism, I think you said, is that it's a connection of two ideas. It's a repetition of two ideas that help explain each other. I always thought synonym, because I see parallel, and I learned that the LL and parallel, are two ideas standing exactly by each other and the same. But I think the use of that word in describing this literary tactic is a little bit different. Can you tease that apart for me?
Well, and I think this psalm in particular is a great example of that because it's comparing two things.
And contrasting.
And contrasting them.
Okay.
What two groups of people do we see in this wisdom psalm?
The wise and the foolish.
The wise and the foolish.
The wicked.
And,
wicked. Hard word.
That just means out of order.
Out of
right?
sync.
I mean, it doesn't necessarily carry the idea of this evil.
Right. Yeah.
So there are comparisons here, and there are also contrasts here. And when it's comparing through parallelism, the two ideas are connected with an and or something like that. When they're contrasting, they're connected usually by the word but.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in this one, we have a contrast, not so.
Yeah.
So in verse 4, we just heard all about the wise, blessed one. And then verse 4 says, not so, the wicked.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes on to describe what the wicked or the foolish would be like.
So the parallelism you're pointing out is the blessed and the wicked.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask, though, when the psalmist is talking about the blessed and describes those, are those not parallel as well?
Yeah, those are parallel ideas too.
Do I get a sticker?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's one of the really amazing things about parallelism is by having all of those, we get a much more full picture of what the blessed person is.
Mm-hmm.
By looking at all of the different descriptions of the fool, we get a bigger picture of what the fool is. And really, wisdom literature, I think, is best summed up as there's two paths. There's God's path, and there's not God's path.
Okay.
And sometimes we'll see words like, happy is the man who, or happy is the woman who.
Mm-hmm.
And that's usually the person who does what?
Walks God's path.
Walks God's path.
Well, and you see that in verse 6, which is kind of the summary statement for Psalm 1. The Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but
Mm-hmm.
the way of the wicked leads to destruction. So you see the blessing of the Lord, you see the consequences of poor choices, and you see the word but kind of stitching them up.
Yeah.
What would you say to the person who says, but you know what? I feel like I walk on both paths.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things I stubbed my toe on when I first read Psalm 1 was, what is the law of the Lord referring to? And it's the word Torah or instruction, the instruction of Yahweh.
So it's not just a rule, right?
Yeah, but it also shows up in the New Testament, that same phrase. In fact, Romans 7:22, for in my inner being I delight in God's law. But Romans is full of verses that say things like, chapter 3, verse 9, there's none righteous, no, not one. So all of us walk on both paths.
Mm-hmm.
All of us at times experience the blessing of walking in God's path and realizing this really is wisdom. God's ways are so much better and higher than my ways.
Mm-hmm.
And all of us have experienced those moments where we are not on God's path, where we decide to do things our own way and experience what that actually feels like when we're not on God's path. And so to that person, I hope that they hear, yeah, all of us do that.
But the whole idea is that when we find ourselves walking on the not God's path, that wisdom draws us away to God's path where there's a better way because we're not walking it alone.
Yeah, from any spot and at any time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so as we're looking through the Psalms and we're looking for wisdom Psalms, some of the themes we can look for are like happy are or blessed are or foolishness versus blessing or something like that. But the main thing we need to keep in mind whenever we run into those is not that we're always going to live that way, but especially in those moments when we find ourselves not on the wise path, wisdom is crying out and inviting us back to God's path.
All right, so there are these wisdom psalms, and as we'll see, there are royal or kingly psalms. There are psalms of lament. There are liturgical psalms, lots of different types of psalms. And being aware of the type of psalm that we're reading can really be helpful in knowing how to read the psalms. Well, in recent years, there's been a lot of hype about royal weddings and royal babies and just the royal family. Well, in ancient Israel, they were interested in that kind of thing too, but they were also anxiously awaiting a different kind of royalty, a great king who would bring victory and peace. And that's why quite a few of the psalms are what we call royal or kingly psalms. And the group will talk about them after a quick time out. Well, you've probably heard me say that Discover the Word is part of Our Daily Bread Ministries, and we are committed to fueling a Bible engagement movement around the world. And also that we are a listener-supported ministry, which means that no one person makes all we do here at Our Daily Bread Ministries possible. Rather, it's all of us working together. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, your gift, whether it's large or small, does make a difference. You can give online at discovertheword.org. Click the Donate tab. And you'll see there a great way to support the ministry of Discover the Word, and that's by becoming a Discover the Word partner. You can join our dedicated group of friends who have volunteered to give an automatic donation every month. And you can sign up to become a Discover the Word partner When you go online to discovertheword.org, click the Donate button. Well, we are closing in on another election here in the U.S., an election that's focused on who will lead the country for the next 4 years. News coverage is focused on it, and we all likely have opinions on who we'd like it to be. Yeah, that leadership position occupies our thoughts a lot. But actually every country around the world obsesses, and I don't think that's too strong a word, obsesses in positive, negative, and hopeful ways about the person who holds that title of leader. And as you read the Psalms in the Bible, you notice that. There are a lot of Psalms that talk about a king. So much so that there's a whole genre of Psalms we classify as kingly or royal Psalms. And so some things about the focus on kings and royalty is what the group will talk about next. And since Daniel is leading, he begins the conversation with this question.
What's your favorite movie or TV show about royalty?
The Crown.
So what are some of the characteristics of royalty that show up in The Crown?
Yeah, and The Crown is the story really of Queen Elizabeth of England's reign from time she's a tiny little girl on.
The current Queen Elizabeth,
The
not
current
the first
Queen
one.
Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying. Yeah. What are some characteristics of royalty?
Yeah, of royalty.
I was thinking about how set apart they are. They live in their own kind of bubble.
Yeah.
I think about the movie The King's Speech. And the thing that I loved about it was how it showed the humanity of this guy who was king, and yet he had this massive problem that he struggled with. And I just thought that again, kind of the opposite of your thing. Yeah, they live in this bubble, but even in that bubble, they're still people.
They're still human. And that was Queen Elizabeth's father.
Yeah,
actually.
That's right.
And he reigned during the beginning of the Second World War. And so he had to speak.
Yeah.
And it was difficult.
On the radio. And it was one of those earliest times when a royal had to be able to speak in public. And for him to have a really bad stuttering problem was huge. So, yeah.
All I think of is all the articles I've been reading lately about the royal family.
Yeah, right.
And think of the pressures that are on those
besieged.
people. You think of the entitlements on one hand, the enormous wealth and the honor that they're given, but there's enormous pressure as well.
There's also an element of great responsibility in the ruling.
Yes.
And you see that in many royals. This great responsibility, almost a mantle, of leadership that sits upon them. And that's probably what we should have started with. Most royals take it very seriously, almost a spiritual calling, a spiritual anointing, if you will, to lead. I mean, when you're crowned, there is a whole ceremony.
Right. And throughout history, so much of royalty was simply thought in terms of its absolute power, this bearing the right of life and death, bearing the sword, being able to mobilize your armies to crush your enemies, whether they're internal or external.
Yeah, so we have the weight of the position.
Usually born into, right, historically.
Yep, and that responsibility that comes with it. You have the set apartness. Every once in a while, Bill, what you're describing, the curtain gets pulled back and we get to see that they are really human beings. And royalty, the reason we're talking about it is because that's one of the genres of psalms that show up, royal or kingly psalms. And I don't know about you, but I've kind of always struggled when I hit my toe on those because we're so far removed from a monarchy.
And how are we supposed to interpret them?
And how are we supposed to interpret them? But it's a genre, a type of literature that shows up in the Psalms where there's these events in the life of the king that are described, or God is described as having a special relationship with the king or something like that. And so it's hard for us sometimes to know what to do with those. Maybe it's a little easier now that we've seen some of these movies and shows to realize some of the characteristics of royalty.
Now, I'm just wondering, they talk about the king's relationship to God and God's relationship to the king. Before Israel was a monarchy, God was their king.
Yeah.
So is that piece in the royalty psalms where we see God himself as their king?
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. In fact, there's two primary types of royal or kingly psalms. Okay. Those that describe the earthly king of Israel and those that describe God as king. And we'll see that actually in this psalm that we're going to read today. Let's turn to Psalm 110 together. This is found in Book 5. And one of the themes of the fifth book of Psalms is this looking forward to not only at that moment when Israel had come out of exile and was back in the land, but also the future moment of when God makes all things right and is with them.
Okay.
Mart, would you like to start for us?
Okay,
Psalm 110, verse 1.
All right. The Lord said to my Lord, sit in the place of honor at my right hand until I humble your enemies, making them a footstool under your feet.
The Lord will extend your mighty scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your troops will be willing on your day of battle. Arrayed in holy splendor, your young men will come to you like dew from the morning's womb.
The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will crush kings on the day of his wrath.
He will punish the nations and fill their lands with corpses. He will shatter heads over the whole earth. But he himself will be refreshed from brooks along the way. He will be victorious.
So this is a royal psalm or a kingly psalm, and usually we can tell because they're thematically related, something about royalty. Again, earthly king or God is king. It can be about coronation or marriage. Psalm 72, which is a fascinating one, says it's a song of Solomon, but as you read it, it's all about the king's son, and so a lot of scholars actually think that it was David who wrote it for Solomon, and it was his prayer for Solomon. But in this psalm, we see some phrases that are kind of awkward. So like, for example, the first one, it starts off with, the Lord said to my Lord.
Yeah.
How do you think the original audience would have heard that?
Well, I don't know how the original audience would have heard it, but I know when Jesus quoted it in the Gospels, it got some attention.
Yeah.
It sure did.
And you know what? Even, I think probably in your Bible too, the first Lord is in caps,
Yep.
which would suggest that they would have heard that say Yahweh or Jehovah, however they heard the name of God. And the second is not in caps.
Yeah.
I think that's so important, and some translations don't give us that clue, which makes it even more difficult.
Yep.
But when you see the Lord all in caps, that helps us immediately go, this is talking about God.
Yep.
Yahweh.
And if you look at the original language there, you see two different words. The first word is the word for Yahweh, and then the second one is the word for king or Lord or master.
Yeah.
And so they would have read that as Yahweh said to the king.
The King of Heaven says to the King of Earth.
So
Yeah.
much
Right.
cleaner. Yeah, that's helpful.
And then he says, you're at my right hand. What does that mean?
Well, it was a position of authority and power, but it was, in a sense, received power from the right hand of the one you were sitting
Of the
beside.
King of Heaven
Yeah.
is got the King of the Earth, his King, at his right hand.
Yeah. You're at my right hand. You're the second in control, second in command. In fact, I think one of the fascinating things in the Bible, and specifically as we think of kings, is the fact that the King of Heaven often uses men and women to do his work.
Yeah.
And so when we see that idea of the king at the right hand of God, I think one of the helpful things for us, since we don't have a king in the West, is just to think of the fact that it's amazing that God uses men and women to do his work on earth.
The dark side of that is oftentimes earthly kings have presumed
Yeah.
that kind of authority.
Divine
and-
authority.
Yeah.
Some of the other ideas that we see here in this psalm, rule from Zion. When they heard that, they would have thought of Jerusalem. In verse 3, it talks about the army being rebuilt kind of in this constant fashion. And so this constant supply of young men, which would have been music to their ears as they had just come out of exile and they're newly back in the land. And so this idea that they would be safe again in that land. But there's a question that they were really struggling with at this point. They came out of exile. They had the land back. They started rebuilding the temple, but they were always under somebody else's rule. And so in Book 5, one of the primary themes is we have to rethink this idea of kingship because we don't have one.
You're saying Israel,
Israel.
even after exile. Yeah.
And so they didn't have a king. And so these types of psalms become what we call the seedbed for the messianic hope of the fact that one day a Davidic king is coming. And as a result of that Davidic king, all of these amazing things, evil being destroyed, of us being settled, of us being at peace, all of that becomes a reality because of the king that's coming. And so, Bill, as you mentioned, this is a psalm that gets quoted a lot in the New Testament. In fact, there's 20 references to this psalm in the New Testament. And after Jesus used those words specifically in Matthew 26 through 64, this is how the high priest responds. He tears his clothes and says, "Why do we still need witnesses? You've heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" And they answered, "He deserves death." This was such an important idea to them, this idea that there was a king coming who would make everything right. And they were 100% convinced at that point that it was not Jesus who had just quoted this. In fact, that was so offensive to them that it led to Jesus' death. But then Jesus rose again and showed that he was a different kind of king. And so as we go back into Psalms and read some of these royal and kingly Psalms, we can look at Jesus and realize that so many of these promises that we look at and either we struggle with or don't seem to be a reality, a lot of them came true in Jesus. He became the king that Israel needed and wanted, and he became our king too.
Powerful conclusion to that part of our conversation about how to read the Psalms. Jesus was the promised king that Israel was so anxiously waiting for, even though most didn't realize it at the time. And now we're looking forward to when Christ comes again and establishes his eternal kingdom. All right, so that's another kind of psalm, the royal or kingly psalms that talk about earthly kings and also about the heavenly king. Well, one of the biggest reasons so many people are drawn to the book of Psalms is that as we read the Psalms, we sense that God gives us permission to feel all that we experience as humans living in a broken world. And it's almost like he invites us to express and vocalize those feelings to him. Sure, we can express praise and joy to God. That almost goes without saying. But Psalms seems also to let us know that we can vent our anger and our pain and our sense of loneliness to him as well. Have you ever had a psalm that you identified with in that way, and it really ministered to you when you were in an extremely difficult time? Well, next, Daniel and Mart and Elisa and Bill will continue this conversation about how to read the Psalms by talking about the type of psalm that does this, the Psalms of Lament.
When was the last time you felt the brokenness of the world?
This morning.
That's what I was going to say, is this morning, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wonder if there are very many moments when we don't feel it.
Yeah, it's easy to put out of your mind. I say most of the time I don't think about it.
Don't dwell on it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but when you're quiet
yeah.
and you begin to just reflect on what's happening not only in your own life, but in the lives of your neighbors, of your family, your extended family, your nation, it's just, man.
And those times in our lives where we feel it personally with kids or family or friends.
Ministries.
Ministries. Watching people go through things can be so hard.
Mm-hmm.
When's the last time you talked with God about what was wrong in the world?
This morning.
Yes.
Yeah,
I think it's one of those things where the Kyrie eleison, the Lord have mercy, God have mercy, Christ have mercy on us. And sometimes the only way you can respond to the brokenness of the world is to just ask God to somehow bring mercy into that situation.
Yeah.
So in that case, all of you have lamented. The term lament is a term that basically just means to mourn aloud or to say aloud, to bring attention to something that's bad in the world. But as we'll see as we continue our conversation on the Psalms, the lament Psalms are written, and some of them were most likely spoken aloud, but some of them might have been scratched on different things or internalized, because sometimes our personality will drive the way that we express a lament. For some of us, a journal is a much better place to talk with God about what's wrong in the world than out loud with a friend.
Okay, so what's the difference, and forgive my ignorance on this, but what's the difference between lamenting and whining? Sometimes I think my own laments, even when I lament to God, sometimes I feel like I'm just moaning.
Or complaining or something.
Yeah, so what's the difference between proper lament, if I can put it that way, and just belly aching?
I think God's okay with both.
Okay.
I like your answer.
Um,
I think that's great.
And I think as we read some of the lament psalms, some of them do feel like belly aching and
Yeah.
whining.
Mm-hmm.
And to Bill's point, it doesn't necessarily put the best face on us.
No, it doesn't. Yeah.
But why would you say, I think God's okay with that?
Because I think sometimes we just end up in the worst spots. We know we're whining, but it's still the most honest expression of what we feel.
And at least we're whining to God.
Yeah.
And that's maybe a difference between just whining.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's so many times I've heard, the first prayer to pray is help.
Yeah.
And whining is a help. I don't
Mhm.
like this.
Yeah.
So if it's directed to God, that's where help comes from.
How does that hit you, Bill?
When I sense that I'm just whining, I don't feel like I'm honoring God in the way that I'm talking to him about it. And,
Yeah.
and maybe that's just because of my own.
But that sounds
inadequacies.
honest. That sounds
Yeah.
honest too. I mean,
Mhm.
yeah.
So the two major pieces of a lament in the Bible are drawing attention to what's wrong in the world and then asking God to do something about it.
Mm.
Hmm.
And so maybe whining is just too much of drawing just attention to what's wrong
Okay.
and not asking God to do anything about it.
I read a quote from one of our friends who's been at the table with us, Ann Voskamp. And she said, lament is a cry of belief in a good God, a God who has his ear to our hearts, a God who transfigures the ugly into beauty.
Hmm. From what you said, Danny, it almost sounds like whining is not when we do it before God.
Mhm.
It's like when we don't know the right place to do it, and
Yeah.
or in whose presence it really
Yeah.
helps to
Almost
do that.
separate from him.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So these two major pieces draw attention to what's wrong in the world and then ask God to do something about it. That's basically what a lament in the
Mm.
Bible looks like. And there's two different types of laments in the Psalms. There's community laments. One of the things that we've spent a lot of time in here learning about is that the language of the Bible is often a we versus an I. And we see that in the Psalms. There's a lot of community laments that have the we language. Often you'll see them asking God to rescue the people versus myself. But there's also a lot of individual laments.
David especially.
David especially.
Yeah.
And individual laments, you end up with the I, me, help me, or the my, as we'll see in just a minute. And then there's a few key components that we can look for to recognize a lament. They're not always present, but these tend to be there. And the first is just an address to God. And so someone read for me Psalm 22, verses 1 through 2, and listen for the address to God.
Okay, verse 1 of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning.
My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest.
Okay, now first of all, there's some parallelism in there since you've asked us to pay attention to that.
Yep.
I cry by day and by night.
And why are you so far from me?
Yep.
And this is a Psalm of David,
Mhm.
too. Wow.
Yeah. And so the address to God is one of the first key components that we often see in a
Okay.
lament, looking to God and drawing attention to what's wrong in the world. And then there's the complaint. Sometimes it's someone else's fault and not the psalmist's fault. And
Mhm.
sometimes it's the psalmist's fault.
Is it sometimes God's fault?
In verse 2, it says, I call to you, but you don't answer.
That's
Mhm.
right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Sometimes the psalmist is asking God and somewhat blaming God for what's
Mhm.
going on in their life. And that's one of the invitations in laments that we really need to not lose track of in our lives. Is it's okay to have honest conversations with God about what's wrong in the world,
Mm.
including, why are you allowing this to happen, Lord? Someone read for me verses 6 through 8 and just listen for whose fault is it or who's he struggling with. Mart, you already mentioned that in this one he does reference God, but listen to some of the other language here. So Psalm 22 verses 6 through 8. Elisa, you want to read that?
Sure. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him.
So he's talking about other people in his life. They're
Kind of
looking
mocking,
at
yeah.
mocking and
Mhm.
scoffing. Should remind us of Psalm 1. There we
Mm.
talked about there's two paths, and the path of the fool is the
Mm.
one who scoffs and mocks.
But he feels it's so deeply. And says, this is so intense and personal.
That he calls himself what?
A worm.
A worm.
Not
I'm not even a man.
I'm scorned. I'm despised by all. It sounds like an overstatement, like, especially if this is David. Yeah, he had his enemies, but man, when you bear the crown, you've got a lot of people looking up to you.
He's the king, yeah.
So far we've seen the address to God. We've seen the complaint. Oftentimes in laments, we'll see a request as well. Mart, would you read verse 11 for us of Psalm 22?
Okay. Don't stay so far from me, for trouble is near, and no one else can help me.
And then in verses 19 through 21, he repeats that same idea. So again, parallelism. Don't be far from me. Deliver me. Rescue me. So I love how his first honest request is just don't be far away. God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me? Do not be far from me. So his first request is, God, please just remind me of your presence. And then he asks to be delivered as well. And then another piece of laments that we often see is the psalmist will offer some reasons that they think it'd be good for God to help.
Here's what I would do if I were you.
Yeah.
This part I relate to.
So Bill, read for us verses 9 and 10.
Okay. Yet you are he who brought me forth from the womb. You made me trust when upon my mother's breasts. Upon you I was cast from birth. You have been my God from my mother's womb.
Help me, because you created me and you're my God and you've taught me to trust you.
I did not choose to be born. I didn't ask for this.
Yep. And so that's the supporting reason. God, help me because you're my God. And then there's expressions of confidence, which we see in verse 19 where he says, you're my strength. And then there's promises to praise the Lord when all is said and done, which we see in verses 22 through 25. I will declare your name to my people. In the assembly I will praise you. And then in verse 25, from you comes the theme of my praise in the great assembly before those who fear you. I will fulfill my vows. The Psalms are full of laments. In fact, half the Psalms in the first 3 books are lament Psalms where life is just tough. And a lot of those are written by the man after God's own heart. And so for us, when we end up in those moments of complete despair, maybe we don't even have the words to pray. A prayer like Psalm 22 can really be helpful to put words to the struggles that we're feeling as we look to God for help, trusting that he will, and then praising him when he does.
Yeah, such powerful depictions of sadness and despair recorded for us in so many of the Psalms, but also coupled with the hope that God is good, and one day our sorrow will turn to joy. Another helpful discussion on how to read the Psalms, and they talked about another type of psalm, the Psalms of Lament. But you've heard the saying, right, that the night is always darkest just before the dawn. And in a similar way, songs of lament often turn into songs of praise and trust in God. And so to close this episode, they're going to look at some of what we'll call liturgical psalms and see how they inspire us to praise and thanksgiving and worship. All right, liturgical psalms in just a moment. Now, I think it was Mart who has said that in many instances, the Psalms demonstrate how to express our human emotion to God. Most of the time in the Bible, God is speaking to us. The Psalms are often us speaking to God, like the lament Psalms. And so as we come down toward the end of this episode, I'd like to encourage you to listen to some of our archived episodes of Discover the Word that will help you to dig deeper into the individual Psalms. We've studied quite a few lament psalms, like Psalm 59, the Song of a Fearful Heart, in which you'll discover that you can tell God anything, just like David did. And I think you'll find it reassuring to know that God understands our human nature, and he is our safest refuge. Others as well, like Psalm 13, Psalm 27, Psalm 71, Psalm 139, all lament psalms. And we've done studies of wisdom psalms and royal psalms and praise psalms. So I hope you will check out our archive at discovertheword.org by clicking on the archive tab that's up at the top of the page and then simply typing psalm into the search bar. The archive is a popular section of our discovertheword.org site. And now let's wrap up part 2 of our study about how to read the Psalms, in which we've talked about the different kinds of psalms that are included in the Psalter. And Daniel wants to do just a quick review of where this episode has taken us, and then talk about a couple other classifications of psalms that will help us as we read.
So we've been talking about the Psalms, and we've talked about parallelism, which is what?
Ideas that repeat in order to underline the main point that the writer's making.
Yeah, either by comparison or contrast.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or explaining further.
Yeah.
Yeah. We often think of poetry and think of rhyme. In Hebrew poetry, it has more to do with two ideas being placed next to each other and what they say about one another. And so that's the idea of parallelism. And then we've also been talking about a few different types of genres. What are some of the genres that we've covered this week?
Well, the wisdom genre, the wisdom psalms are really comparing God's path to not God's path, I think is the way you put it, but, and we usually have one foot in each and walk straddled across it, but God's path is the wise path.
Yeah, and when you say genre, it just means kind, right?
Yeah.
Different kinds of
Yeah, but it didn't
songs.
sound half as cool. Genre sounds really
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
It's like we have genres of music, jazz, classical.
Yes.
We have genres of books, fiction, nonfiction,
Yeah.
historical fiction.
But that's a good point, because we have different expectations of different kinds of
Right.
material.
One of the types of material that we talked about were royal psalms, where it's either talking about God himself as king or God's king who is reigning on God's behalf, or I think you said the anticipation of the ultimate great king that would come.
We talked about psalms of lament, which would express the groans of our heart expressed to God.
And
Yeah.
asking him to do something about them, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things we didn't get to mention in the Song of Lament is that there's one in particular, Psalm 88, that is almost entirely composed of just the complaint. That's how tough things are. They don't even have the words to trust in God or to ask him for help. All they can do is just cry out in pain. And so for those who are going through tough things, a lament psalm is a way to express that. But not all of us are. Some of us are going through great things. And today the psalm genre, type of poetry that we're going to look at, are songs that are used in worship to God. Sometimes these are called liturgical psalms. Just think of liturgy as kind of like a trellis, right? So you have a grapevine, and the only way to keep that grapevine healthy and to protect it from critters is to put it on a trellis that supports it. But the trellis itself is not the grapevine. And so it's kind of this launching off point for worship. This, hey, here's a few ideas to get you started, and then your worship can flow from there.
And really all worship has some liturgy, whether it's a formal liturgy like from the Book of Common Prayer, or whether it's just a very loosely held. There's some kind of form that the worship takes in order to help us navigate through it, right?
Yep. And there's usually a few pieces to a liturgical psalm. So there's directions to the director, or it tells you what kind of musical instruments to use. It might tell them which melody to use, an old song that they would have known, and use this to sing this psalm. So
and just to help us, we do the same thing. We make an invocation to start the service. We have doxology and a benediction. We use these same kinds of things, just maybe differently.
Yep.
Now, we're talking about a liturgical song that leads us in worship, but it strikes me, Daniel, that this is in Book 4. When it's still dealing with the exile. It's still dealing with the fact that they can't really worship like they think they're supposed to because they don't have temple. They aren't in the land. So how does a liturgical psalm help them when they're still lamenting being in exile?
That's a great question. And I think that in some ways helps us understand when the prophets told them to settle in the land, which they were like, what? Be married in the land, buy houses in the land.
Grow crops.
Not their land,
right?
But in exile in Babylon. So I would imagine that was an identity crisis for them of like, well, how do we live? And then they have these prophets saying, well, live like you would live in your land. And one of the questions that would probably naturally come up is, well, how would we worship there? And so a psalm like this would be really helpful when they're not in the temple. Well, how can I worship? Well, Maybe Psalm 100 is a good place to start.
Okay.
Elisa, would you mind just reading the whole psalm for us, verses 1 through 5?
Sure. Okay. Psalm 100, a psalm for giving grateful praise. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations.
So if Psalm 88 is a lament like no other because it's only the complaint, for those of us who are in a great place where we feel like life is going well, this is the type of psalm for us. Shout to the Lord in joy. What's some of the parallelism that you see in here?
Well, before that, how would they sing enter his gates and courts when they didn't have them? I mean, enter his gates with thanksgiving, his courts with praise. That's parallelism, so I'll answer your question that way. But, I mean, what do they view as courts when the temple's not there?
You know where I go, and this may be silly, but I go to imaginary. You know, we don't have the gates either, but we can imagine that, and they actually probably had seen them, so they can imagine that.
And I think in doing that, we're building on Bill's point and on yours. They're in a bad situation. You said, here's a psalm when everything is going great for us. But it's just the opposite for them. I mean, not entirely, I'm sure, but it was not good for them. So it's not just a psalm
That's good.
to sing when everything's going great.
Yeah, and you know those moments in life where things aren't going well, but you have that moment of still confidence that God is God and can work all things out for good.
That's what verse 3 says. You're right, Daniel. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. So you're shouting, and even in the midst of perhaps doubting, as you're suggesting, Mart, you remind yourself who God is and that he is good. The threading together of lament with thanksgiving, give thanks in all circumstances, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians. You see this here. If you're going to sing this psalm in a difficult time.
Right, and given that context, the implication must be that having sung these words in a bad situation, we may be more likely to have that insight, that shift of perspective in dark times.
Yeah.
I also think, too, that there's something about music that impacts us at a deeper level,
Right.
that infiltrates our hearts
Yep.
in a different way.
So we see a lot of instructions in this. It actually tells us at the beginning that this is depending on your translation, either a psalm of thanksgiving or some of, I think the NIV says, a psalm for giving grateful praise. And so it gives you some instruction of when this is a good time to use the psalm. We've also talked about how genres are messy. Is this a psalm of praise or a psalm of thanksgiving?
Yes.
Yes. Right? It's both. It's got both pieces in it, which might speak exactly to the point, Mart, that you were bringing our attention to, which is the fact that they're in a moment of not knowing sometimes how to praise or how to give thanksgiving. And so this psalm would help give words maybe to something that they haven't said in a long time or felt in a long time. So there's some instructions. It tells us when to use it. And then it says why we should do it, because the Lord's God. Because he made us, because we belong to him, because he provides for us. That's that reference to the sheep of his pasture. So these psalms, these genres, help us to express those emotions that are deep within us. And there's some others too. We haven't talked about all the genres, have we, Bill?
Sure. One of the genre that's very much in the book of Psalms was what scholars, I think, call salvation history psalms, where the Jewish people rehearse God's rescue of them in the Exodus and brings them into the land. And then there's some that are creation psalms, where it reflects on God's work in creation, which is hinted at even in this one.
And that's where the conversation of genre is helpful, because sometimes we're in really dark places and we need some way to express the deepest laments of our heart. And Psalms offers a way to do that with the lament psalm. Draw attention to what's wrong with the world and ask God to do something about it. Some of us are in places of praise. Life is going great, and Psalms of praise offer us a way to give credit to God and to just rest in the goodness that we're experiencing. Some of us have been just feeling like the Lord is continuing to teach us about his path and not his path. And a wisdom psalm might be a good way to parallel those two ideas and to describe what it looks like to follow God and not follow God. So wherever we are in life, Psalms offers us the opportunity to process that in a form of poetry that is ancient, but obviously speaks just as much to us today.
Wrapping up part 2 of our study called How to Read the Psalms. In this episode, we've been talking about some of the different kinds of psalms, because as we're learning, there is a psalm for every season of life. You've been listening to Discover the Word with your study partners, Mart DeHaan, Elisa Morgan, Bill Crowder, and Daniel Ryan Day. And in the next episode, part 3 of this 5-part series on how to read the Psalms, we'll take a closer look at how this collection of psalms is broken into 5 books, and how those groupings help us better understand the individual psalms that are within them. Because maybe you've noticed the Book 1, Book 2, Book 3, Book 4, Book 5 headings at different points in the Psalms. But do you know why those division markers are there? Well, we'll find out in the next edition of the Discover the Word podcast. Discover the Word is a small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures and also challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ. So thanks for listening. I'm Brian Hettinga. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministries.